because I'm an historian, I'm interested in what Jesus would have sounded like to his first century Jewish audience. But that doesn't mean that what he sounded like has no value for people today. In the same way that looking at other people's religious traditions, we can look at sayings attributed to Confucius or to the Buddha or material in the Quran and the Hadith and say, well, this has a particular meaning to the people who first heard it or the people who first spoke it. But those meanings continue over time.
Dynamic biblical discussions with special guests exploring tough biblical issues, academic scholarship, ethics, archaeology, textual criticism, Old Testament, New Testament, Bible interpretation, apocalyptic literature, Christian history, ancient Near East cultures. You're tuned in to Conversations with Pastor Cliff on Puluso Ministries.
Good day, everybody. Welcome back to another episode. Today we have AJ. She's no stranger to our platform. She has been here before. And AJ, welcome back to Puluso Ministries.
I'm delighted to join you again.
Thank you. Today we'll be talking about your new book that came out on the 6th of August, Jesus for Everyone. So it's a very intriguing book. I've checked it out, read it, and very gripping book. So we're going to dive right into it and just peel it off and see how we can help our audience to actually even get the book. So perhaps maybe as our first question to kickstart our conversation, your book Jesus for Everyone. You frame this book and aim to push a teaching that is accessible to everyone, on a broader audience. So tell me now, how do you balance the complexities of academic theology, academic scholarship to the lay audience that you pretty much write to in this book?
Yeah, thanks for the question. First of all, academics can be obscure. We use lots of technical terminology because it makes us sound smart, and we use lots of jargon. So we talk about the eschatological, soteriological implication of the pericope based on redaction something. And there's no reason to sound like that. We can just talk like normal people, which is what I want to do. So my target audience when I'm writing is, I think, would my mother understand this? Would the person who does my finances understand this? And people who are outside of the whole theological realm. And the next thing is, the book was originally supposed to be called, according to the press, Jesus for Atheists. In other words, take all the theology out. And the more I started working with that title, the less I liked it. So we wound up changing the title to Jesus for Everyone. And the subtitle is Not Just Christians. So what I do in terms of theology is I take theological concerns like the incarnation, the divine taking on flesh, the Christmas story, or the resurrection, or the ascension, where according to the Gospel of Luke, after 40 days following the resurrection, Jesus ascends up into heaven, from which he will eventually come back down again. I take all of those theological concerns, including things like the Trinity and original sin, and I bracket all that stuff. So if you're a Christian and you believe all that stuff, I'm not challenging any of your beliefs whatsoever. And if you're not a Christian and you don't believe any of that stuff, I'm not saying you have to believe this. I'm simply looking at the text to figure out how, given contemporary societies, and this is global, culture wars, where we're fighting over politics and economics and family values and questions of the legacy of slavery, which means class status, and language. How can we use the New Testament, the words attributed to Jesus, the stories told by him like parables, and the stories told about him in the gospel narratives? How can we use that material to help us think our way through some of this culture war stuff? And at least here in the United States, when some of our politicians are saying, well, the Bible says this and I believe it, but, they wind up not quoting the Bible, or they only quote the first part of a verse and not the last part of a verse. How can we be more honest when we say this is what we think the Bible says? Let's go retranslate it. Let's see what the Greek says. Let's look back to the Old Testament, to use Christian terminology, the ancient Hebrew and its Greek translation, to try to get a better handle on what these texts would have meant to the people who first heard them. And then how do we make that shift from the first century to the 21st century so we can get lessons out of this today? And finally, I know this is probably going on too long, but I don't look at the Bible as an answer book. Like you should be able to open it up and there's the answer to your problems. Like this, it's turning the Bible into some sort of magic 8-ball, which I think is silly. Uh, but I think the Bible helps us ask the right questions. And Jesus
Mhm.
helps us frame those questions so that if we can actually discuss those questions, then when difficulties arise, since we've already had the discussions, we're in a better position to address them in a friendly and informed manner rather than through the polemic that we're seeing.
That's a very interesting, AJ. But now, in a world that is marked by diverse religious, beliefs and secular ideologies, how do you navigate, presenting Jesus as this universal figure without erasing his particularity of him being a Jew?
Right. It's a both and rather than an either or. So because I'm an historian, I'm interested in what Jesus would have sounded like to his first century Jewish audience. But that doesn't mean that what he sounded like has no value for people today. In the same way that looking at other people's religious traditions, we can look at sayings attributed to Confucius or to the Buddha or material in the Quran and the Hadith and say, well, this has a particular meaning to the people who first heard it or the people who first spoke it. But those meanings continue over time. Uh, I don't think we should limit how we understand Jesus to simply the first century, because then we wind up playing first century Bible land. We don't live in the first century. So,
Mhm.
how do we make that shift? Figuring out what he would have sounded like, and then taking those general lessons and then saying, do we agree with those lessons today? And sometimes we may determine, yes, absolutely. And other times we might think that's a good first century model, but it's not a good 21st century model. And the best example of that is Jesus seems to approve of the institution of slavery because it was normal for people in his culture. Jews owned slaves, Romans owned slaves, Greeks owned slaves, even slaves owned slaves.
Mhm.
This is a very, very complex system of slavery. More than half of the Roman Empire was either enslaved or children of people who were enslaved. And even if you were manumitted, unless you had citizenship, you still didn't have free rights. So you were still more or less connected to the people who owned you or owned your parents or owned your grandparents. So Jesus does not critique the institution of slavery, but in telling parables about enslaved people, many of whom are tortured, in using the language of we should be a slave to others, I think we need to think about 2,000 years of slavery globally, and then say, what do we do with this material today? Does it remind us of people who are still enslaved? Because there are some nations in the world where slavery is still legal. Do we think of people who have been trafficked? Form of slavery? Do we think about people who are in prison who are forced to work as a form of slavery? And how do we take the idea that we are supposed to be slaves to others in a first century context? What would that have sounded like to free people? And what would it have sounded like to slaves? And then what does it sound like to people today? So it
Mhm.
may be that if we're at the head of a major corporation or we're super wealthy, thinking of ourselves as enslaved to others may be helpful because it decenters us, like we're not the center of the world and other people are more important and we have to be in service.
Mhm.
But if we're already having, three jobs to feed our family and we can't find economic solvency, and we're feeling like everybody is demanding our time and we have nothing for us, telling us to be a slave is going to be harmful rather than helpful.
Mhm.
So again, Jesus, by telling parables about slavery or suggesting that people should act as slaves, makes us think about, to whom are we indebted? What does service mean today? Can we even use positive images of slavery given our history of enslaving people? A particular concern in the United States, but not only here, given legacies of slavery over the centuries. These are important questions. Jesus helps us frame them so we can actually talk about them rather than just saying, "Oh well, that was back in the 1800s. We don't do that anymore."
Yeah.
But the legacy of slavery is still with us. Jesus helps us talk about that.
That's so awesome, because I know particularly in the U.S. Slavery it's like a big controversial topic, and there's been a lot of pushback or texts like that address slavery, and you kind of handle it in your book, particularly for the modern world. How do we navigate with this topic of slavery? You also touch on themes of social justice in your book. You talk about these teachings of Jesus, particularly the kingdom of God. How it calls us to action today in the struggle for justice and equality in this world that is very perverse. So how would you now address that to our readers, to say how should Christians implement their daily lives in how they interpret what Jesus calls them into this kingdom of God, and find his teachings in the context of these, social injustice and oppressions that people may find themselves in.
I really like that question because I think it's so important. And I work with a lot of Christians globally who think that Jesus came to save them from their sins and to give them a ticket into heaven. And all they have to do is sit back and now wait, right? They've now accepted belief in the Christ, so they're already saved, and they're pretty much good to go. So they do not engage in social processes, right? Let's let everything take care of itself. But if we look carefully at the Gospels, Jesus is very much interested in what we do in terms of how we live our daily lives. How do we get along with our family members or our neighbors or the local system or people who are not like us, like Samaritans or Gentiles, Jesus coming from a Jewish perspective, or people from Judea who are not from the Galilee, which raises questions of regionalism. So the first thing is that if we want to think about the kingdom of heaven, instead of waiting for God to bring the whole thing in, Jesus is saying, how do you live as if you've got one foot in that kingdom already? And I find this to be remarkably helpful. So there's an old Jewish saying, it goes back to the Talmud, but there's an old Jewish saying for everything. There's an old Jewish saying from the Talmud that says, repent one day before you die. Which I think is just really helpful. So I think Jesus is using that same Jewish model that says, let's say the world is about to end. The world as we know it is about to end on Tuesday. And given global war and given nuclear power, that actually is a real possibility. But let's say the world is going to end on Tuesday. What would you do today that you might not have done if you knew you had another 10 years? Do you remember at the end of the day to tell people that you love them and let them know that? Your spouse or your kids or your parents or your best friends. If you know someone is in the hospital or somebody is ailing, do you make that phone call or send the text or send the email today rather than saying, oh, I'm too busy, I have to go to lunch, I'll email tomorrow because that person may die tomorrow. So if we're more intentional, if we're more self-aware of what needs to get done, of how to fix our mistakes rather than saying, oh, well, okay, I made a mistake, but if I just ignore it, it'll go away. Well, it may not go away. It may fester, it may metastasize, and things will get worse. So live as if you've got one foot in the kingdom of heaven already. And Jesus is very deliberate about this. He says, if you have and somebody else needs, you give. Why should you have two coats if somebody else doesn't have a coat? Or why should you have two pairs of shoes if somebody else is going barefoot? So take care of other people. Recognize that everybody is in the image and likeness of God. And then how do you become part of that broader family? Recognize not only your own talents and your own gifts, because Jesus is not a one-size-fits-all model. He doesn't tell Mary and Martha to give their home away because they're providing hospitality. But figure out what your gifts are and then how you can share those gifts with other people rather than just sticking your head in the sand and waiting for God to fix the whole thing, because that's probably not going to happen. So how does Jesus, a first century Jew, knowing that we work in partnership with God, right? So we're in the image and likeness of God. We're supposed to be godlike in what we do in terms of kindness and mercy and generosity. How do we go out and do that? And that's going to hit us in terms of what we do hour to hour. It's going to make a difference for our bank account. It's going to make a difference for determining, do I really need this or can I give it to somebody else? And I think that's a very helpful way of living.
And AJ, thanks for that. But now, how do you then present Jesus not only as this savior figure, but also as a moral exemplar whose life and actions should be emulated in our daily lives, or for everybody out there? We should emulate him, not as a figure of salvation.
Right. And so what I'm doing is I'm bracketing the theological concerns and I'm looking at Jesus as a teacher of wisdom, as I would look at the Buddha or Confucius or other people who have said very smart things over the centuries. In some cases, I think it's our responsibility also to have a chat with Jesus, because there are certain places in the New Testament, in the Gospels, where Jesus suggests something that might have worked for him that does not work for me. For example, Jesus tends to separate families. He tells us in Matthew chapter 10, the mission discourse, quoting the prophet Micah, that father will be against son and son will be against father and daughter and mother, daughters-in-law and mothers-in-law, for which you don't need divine revelation for that. That's just going to happen anyway in some cases. That your natal family is not the most important family. The family of faith is the most important. Well, for me, my family is more important than pretty much anything. So here I'm going to have a pushback on Jesus. And I think that's helpful too. In our contemporary society, we're having such debates about gender identity and who can marry and under what circumstances can you marry and how many people can you marry. And if you happen to have 4 wives and you emigrate to the United States, can you keep all 4 wives or do you have to get rid of 3? I mean, these are major questions. So by looking at what Jesus says about family values, as well as what he says about sexuality and gender roles, I think we're in a better position to negotiate some of the culture wars that are surrounding questions of what men do, what women do, what families do, questions of childbirth and child rearing, and so on.
Mhm. And following up on that, issue of family, how Jesus views family. Tell me now, what do you think Jesus was conveying about the nature of families, family relationship, and how should these shape Christian family values today as we navigate in this world?
Right. And here for me, it's very important to recognize Jesus as a first century person. I mean, Jesus is not a feminist. He didn't invent feminism. He didn't invent the pantsuit. He's living in a patriarchal society. So are we, for that matter. Women are still making, across the globe, women are still making less money than men for the same jobs.
Mhm.
So what he's suggesting is when you identify your family, he's told, I'm citing Mark here, but the same story gets picked up in Matthew. He's told your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside and they want to talk to you. And he's teaching inside a house and the house is very crowded. And he looks around at the people who are listening to his teaching and he says, who are my mother and brothers and sisters? Those who hear the will of God and do it. So in that sense, he's redefining the family. Not in terms of biology, not in terms of the womb from which we came out or the sperm that contributed to us, not in terms of who our parents are, not in terms of who our sisters and brothers are natally, but these are the people in the community. So what does that mean for people in the church, for example? It means that when you come into a church, the people sitting in the next pew, if they're members of your congregation, they're actually your brothers and sisters and mothers, which means you ought to take care of them. And if they're missing, you get on the phone or you send a text and say, where are you? In the same way, if a member of your family was missing, you do that. Or if it's after a worship service and people are going to lunch and you see a person sitting by himself or sitting by herself, you say, do you want to join us? Because that's a member of the family. So it's an alternative construction of family values. Today, we might want to wrestle with that. Is our true family the family in the church, or is our true family the one to we have deepest loyalty to our spouse, to our biological children, to our biological parents? And
Mhm.
Jesus says, you might want to think about that. And also, you might want to think about alternative family configurations. So here in the United States, we have some politicians who insist that a family has to be a mother and father and a bunch of kids. But then I look at the families in the New Testament. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. I have 3 siblings living together. No mention of husbands or wives, no mentions of kids, and that's fine. Or when Jesus calls the apostles James and John, they leave their father in the boats with the staff, with the hired laborers. And James and John followed Jesus into the movement. So separating parents and children, which I think is sometimes very helpful for kids whose parents say, you have to go into the family business. You have to do exactly what mommy and daddy want you to do. And today Jesus is saying, you know what? You have to find your own path. And sometimes you have to find your own calling. And that's helpful for me as a parent, because, of course, I want to micromanage everything my kids do. And Jesus says, no, you can't do that. Your kids are their own people, and they will find their own calling. And that's good for me as a parent to recognize.
Yeah. And you touch on economics in your book. So how do you then interpret view his Jesus's view on wealth and poverty, particularly in the context of the rich fool and the story of the widow's mite, as you pen out in your book? How do
Right.
you interpret? Yeah.
There are a lot of stories about Jesus and economics. So in my book, Short Stories by Jesus, I looked at some of the stories about Jesus and economics, like the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, where Lazarus, who has, he's diseased in his body, he's got no money, and he winds up in the breast of Abraham, this kind of heavenly high rent district. And this rich guy lands in hell. So basically, when Jesus tells a story that begins, there was a rich man who, like the parable of the rich fool or the parable of the dishonest manager. If you have a parable that begins, there was a rich man who, you know, the ending is not going to be good for the rich man. Which already, I mean, I think it alerts us, you know, how do we want to be known in the world? It's an old moral exercise. What would you, when you die, what would you want on your gravestone? And if on your gravestone, richest guy in town, probably not. You know, cornered the stock market, had shares in whatever. Or do you want to be known as kind to neighbors, or compassionate, or generous, or loving? So Jesus actually spends a lot of time with rich people. He's not just hanging out with poor people. He's hanging out with the rich people, like Zacchaeus, a very rich tax collector. Mary and Martha, they got money. You know, Mary has like really expensive ointment that she's using to anoint Jesus' feet in John chapter 12. Pretty upscale family. And what he's doing is he's saying, if you have money and you know there are poor people out there, then open your home and be hospitable and show that hospitality, not to just people who are in your same social class, but to the people who could not possibly afford to reciprocate. And he's got a lot of sayings about that. He's got lots of condemnation of rich people. But what we do see also in the Gospels is we see, first of all, rich people who know what to do with their money. Joseph of Arimathea is very well connected. He can get access to the governor. That's pretty good. I mean, I can't get access to the governor of Tennessee, where I live, let alone to people in the White House in the United States. But he's got access. So he's got money. He's got his own tomb that's upscale. But he's not identified just as a rich guy. Matthew says he's a rich guy. But he's a rich guy who uses his money in service to other people, including Jesus, who's basically a stranger to him. That's pretty good. Nicodemus is very wealthy, and he uses his money to help bury Jesus with very, very fancy funeral trappings. So how do we use our money appropriately? There's also a parable in the Gospel of Matthew, sometimes called the parable of the laborers in the vineyard, where people get paid the same amount at the end of the day, even though some have worked from 6 o'clock in the morning and some only started at 5 o'clock at night. And the people who worked early grumble. And the landowner says, "This is my money. Can't I do with it what I want?" And I'm thinking, I as a reader might, no, actually, legally you can, but morally, maybe not. Morally, you have a debt to other people, and you might want to think about that. As far as the widow who puts her 2 coins in the temple treasury, Jesus says, he's talking to his disciples, and he says, "Do you see this widow?" They're all people who are putting in lots of donations. They're not blowing trumpets, by the way, but they're putting in lots of donations, as you would if you went to a church and there was like a charity box, or in some churches you can purchase a candle, so you put in some coins and you have a candle to light or whatever, or a collection plate. And some people are putting in lots and lots of money. And Jesus says she's got 2 coins and she puts in both of them. She holds nothing back. And the Greek says she actually gives her whole life. And he honors her for that. At the same time, the reason she can do that is because the temple, like churches or synagogues in antiquity, is a place where poor can go to help them get through the day, where they can get food, where they can get shelter. So what does this say about our dedication? To me, it's not a matter of how much we give, but as Jesus points out, it's a matter of percentage. She gives everything. Now, if you have, a couple of $1 jillion and you give like 10% of your money, you've still got a couple of $1 jillion left, right? So it may seem like a lot, but percentage-wise, not so much. So for me, it raises the question of, why do we honor people with names on buildings or whatnot because they gave, 5% of their money or 1% of their money? And where's that honoring of people who give even more? Because we know that people who are below the poverty line tend to give more in charity percentage-wise than people who are very wealthy. And Jesus says, you pay attention to the poor who are also contributing, even though it may hurt them. And at the same time, recognize that these poor people who may be giving everything have to be taken care of. I do. Finally, he's fussing at the temple system, because if he were, he would have called out, "Hey, ladies, save your money." Right?
Yeah.
The exemplar. And he says he gives her whole life. And what's going to happen? This is in Mark chapter 12. We're moving into the Passion narrative. He's about to give his whole life. She becomes a model for him.
So what I'm hearing you say, AJ, is that money is important, but what matters is how you use it, whether good or bad. Exactly. Yeah. So if we flip onto the issue of ethnicity and race, which is a very touching subject in the in today's world, as we all know. And how do we see Jesus, handling this whole sensitive issue in the Bible, particularly in the context of the Samaritan woman and the Syrophoenician woman? How do we see that play out in the New Testament?
To ensure that we keep bringing you tough conversations like these, please support our ministry by donating as little as 50 Rand per month. You can find our banking details on our website, pulusoministries.co.za.
Right. And here, for me, we find very helpful lessons on how to engage in cross-cultural conversation. What do we expect from people who are not part of our own race, part of our own ethnicity? Or today we might talk about part of our own nationality. So a citizen of the United States, a citizen of South Africa, a citizen of Kenya, a citizen of Mexico, or whatever. And how do we have those conversations? So what I think is really helpful about Jesus here, although it's pretty edgy, is Jesus stands in his own Jewish identity and does not ultimately come down to some sort of lowest common denominator. It's particularly important when we're talking about religion as well, where today we have these, oh yeah, we're all trying to climb up the same mountain and we all have the same goals and we all begin from the same place, and we don't, right? So I've spent a fair amount of time outside the US, and what I take for granted is something that people outside the US don't take for granted at all. And stuff that they think is fine, like nationalized health care. Well, we don't have it here. I'm going, wow, you can go to the doctor and like you don't have to pay $4,000, whatever. So when Jesus has a conversation with the Samaritan lady, what John does, and this is John chapter 4, is John subverts all the expectations that we might have of speaking with other people. Right at the beginning of the story, and this is typical of John, he sets us up and then he moves us to something that's quite transcendent. We have this note, and it's not clear whether the Samaritan lady says it or John says it. But the Samaritan lady says to Jesus, "Why is it that you, a Jew, are asking a drink of water from me, a Samaritan?" And the next line is, because Jews and Samaritans don't share anything in common. But then I'm thinking, but in fact they do, because they're already having a conversation. And then we learned that the disciples have gone into the town, but the town is a Samaritan town, to go buy lunch. So we begin with the presupposition that there's no sharing at all. And it turns out there's lots of sharing. And then when we do the history, it turns out there's lots of sharing. So for me, when I think about enmity between races or nations or religions, and we say we have nothing to do with you, well, it may turn out that if we go back to the history, we have lots and lots to do with you, because Samaritans and Jews are all descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they live in more or less the same land. And Samaritans are part of that what sometimes gets called the 10 lost tribes. So what Jesus is doing is saying, you might think that you're totally different, but you're not. And at the same time, and I think this is really helpful, the Samaritan lady, who's very, very smart, I like this lady enormously. She gets into a theological discussion with Jesus, and she says, listen, we Samaritans worship here on this mountain. So they're at the village of Sychar. She can just turn around and point to Mount Gerizim, which is where the Samaritan temple had originally stood until about 100 years before a Jewish king named John Hyrcanus burned it down. There's Samaritans to this day worship on Mount Gerizim and still offer the Paschal offering, the Passover sacrifice, because like they're Jews, or Jews are a type of Samaritans. Anyway, we worship on this mountain. You all Jews worship on Mount Zion, which is Jerusalem. Where are we supposed to worship? Jesus says, well, the Jews got it right. In other words, when it comes to the split between what becomes the kingdom of Israel and what becomes the Samaritans, that split, instead of saying you're right and you're right and you're right over here, Jesus, he doesn't sacrifice the particulars of his own religious tradition on the altar of interfaith sensitivity. We think we got it right. He then goes on to say it doesn't really matter where you worship, because the time will come when you don't have to worship here and you don't have to worship here, but you can worship you can worship God in spirit and truth wherever, which is also very helpful. So why is this good? Because in a lot of interfaith conversations, and oh my gosh, I'm in a lot of interfaith conversations, so many people are looking for the lowest common denominator because they don't want to debate. They don't want to disagree, because we don't do well with disagreements, we 21st century people. And Jesus says, you know what? You think you're right and you think somebody else is wrong, you should be able to say so. And the person with whom you're having a conversation, like the Samaritan lady, should be able to say, okay, I see your point. I don't think she agreed with him, by the way, but she still thinks he's pretty smart, and she still thinks he might have something worthwhile to say. So if I'm talking with you and you were to say to me, AJ, Jesus really is the divine Son of God who died on the cross in order to grant forgiveness for humankind, to do away with sin and death, I would say, yeah, I see where you get it. And I can understand how you would get it from particular readings of the New Testament, particular readings, for example, of Paul's epistle to the Romans, or understanding the Gospels, because that's kind of what the New Testament teaches. But that's not my tradition. So I don't think you should give up being who you are. We stay with what we are, but then we listen closely to what somebody else says, and we should be able to disagree. And even after that disagreement, have some sort of fellowship with the people with whom we disagree, which is in fact what Jesus does with the Samaritans. I think that's splendid. And when we get to the story of the Syrophoenician woman in Mark chapter 7, repeated with some variants in Matthew chapter 15, where she's a Canaanite lady, I think what those stories do is they help us. If somebody wants to shut us down, whether because of ethnicity or because of race, or even with the Samaritan lady, because the Syrophoenician lady in Mark 7, because of class, because she's kind of up there, a Greek, a Syrophoenician by birth. I mean, she's a classy lady, and she's very demanding. And I think she's probably a woman of privilege. She barges into this house and says, help me. My daughter is severely demon possessed. And if a person shuts us down, because Jesus shuts her down, I mean, he basically calls her a dog. It's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. And it's not a compliment. Matthew says puppies, but that's still not a compliment. So what do you do? And this is why this story is helpful. Instead of saying, okay, I'm a dog, and you slink away and you feel like you're nothing, or ratcheting up the insult, well, you want to call me a dog? Well, and then up the insult to him and use some sort of negative terminology, which is not going to get us anywhere either. She said, you want to call me a dog? Fine. I'm a dog, but dogs are still entitled to the crumbs. In other words, you take the insult and rather than demean your own humanity and give up your dignity, and rather than ratchet up the violence, you take it and you say, fine, you want to call me a dog? Doesn't matter. I'm still entitled. And he actually says in the Gospel of Mark, because of your word, let it be done for you. And then the exorcism is performed for her daughter. And in Matthew's version, where the woman is a Canaanite, Matthew, who's a brilliant writer, I mean, all the gospel writers, like, they know what they're doing. As soon as this woman is identified as a Canaanite in Matthew, I know exactly she's going to get what she wants. Why? Because if I go to the genealogy in Matthew, the very first chapter, not only in Matthew, but the first chapter in the New Testament, I have at least 2 Canaanite women, probably Tamar, who's married to Abraham's great-grandson. This is Genesis 38. And certainly Rahab, who's the prostitute from Jericho, and Jericho is a Canaanite city. And here I'm in the book of Joshua, chapters 2-6. I know that these Canaanite women are going to get what they want, even though the men with whom they're paired don't do what they're supposed to do. So I've got a story set up. And because I know something about ancient literature, and here's why reading stuff in historical context is important. There were lots of stories in Greek literature, in Roman literature, in later Jewish literature, where you have somebody who's very, very privileged, like an emperor, who's super upper class, a leader. And then you have somebody who's a little bit lower on that social scale, coming and saying, I need something, I need something. There's stories of this in the Old Testament as well, where like the widow of Zarephath comes to Elijah and says, my son is dying, do something. Or the great woman of Shunem comes to Elisha, the prophet, and says, my son is dying, do something. And Elisha's like, oh, well, I'll send my servant. Or the Emperor Augustus says, I'll send a servant. And the woman, through this incredibly clever line, like just stops you in your tracks. The person listens, and then the person does what the woman wants. So what do we find here? Jesus is modeling for his disciples who are, they're going to be running the church. You guys, this person may not be even a member of your church, is from a different community, from a different ethnicity, from a different religious system. But if this person comes to you and says, I need something, and you have that to give, you give. And it also tells those of us who need something, I'm thinking about talking to like the president of a university, like, I need something, you persevere. And if you get shut down, you continue to persevere. That's Matthew. The woman asks for an exorcism for her daughter, who may in Matthew be standing right there. Jesus first ignores her. He says not a word to her. And then he says, listen, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Like, you're not part of my job description. It's like going into a restaurant and somebody saying, you're not at my table, so therefore I'm not going to take your order. Um, and she says, Lord, help me. And he says, look, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. 3 times he tries to shut her down. And 3 times she comes back to him. She engages, she doesn't give up, and she eventually gets what she wants. And I think that's without violence. And I think that's a major way of understanding how we're supposed to function today. Similarly, the parable of the widow and the judge. She keeps bothering him, and she keeps bothering him, and she keeps bothering him. And finally, she threatens to punch him. I don't think she's really going to do it. But it's like, okay, it's enough. I'm going to give you what you want. So Jesus encourages us to persevere, and at the same time, we don't lose our dignity. That's how civil rights worked in the United States. Sit-ins, you don't lose your dignity, but you don't give up pursuing the justice that you need.
AJ, you make profound, connections and examples, particularly from the scripture. You touched earlier on healthcare, and in light of the global challenges that we have on healthcare, how could we implement some of the teachings of Jesus in modern Christianity pertaining to healthcare and advocate for the sick?
Absolutely. And I think Jesus does this. So this is both an ethical concern, and it's also with theological concerns. The concern about bodies, the concern about spirits. We talk about demon possession. Whether they're demons or not, that's up to you. I think human evil is evil enough. I don't need demons to add to it. But I grant that a number of my friends actually do believe in demons and Satan. Fine. The first thing we know is that healthcare is important. So when people say, oh, well, healthcare is not important, so you look at healing there. Jesus keeps healing people over and over and over again for multiple symptoms. Peter's mother-in-law has a fever. There's a fellow with a skin disease. The Greek term is lepros, which is where we get leprosy. But the underlying Hebrew, tsa'arat, is probably something that's temporary, like that flares up and then it disappears, and then it comes back up again, like psoriasis or eczema or seborrhea. And he heals that person. There's a woman who's got some sort of vaginal or uterine bleeding. Mark says he actually dries her up. So he cares about gynecology, which I think is helpful. There are people who are blind. He helps them to see. There are people who are deaf or unable to speak, and he opens up their ears and he loosens their tongues. There are people who are paralyzed and he helps them walk. There are people who act aberrantly. The text calls them demon possessed. It could be a form of epilepsy. It could be a form of neurodiversity, or so on. And he allows these people to live more or less contentedly within broader society, which means that healthcare is important for the mind, for the body. It's also important theologically because bodies are important. The story could have been that Jesus was like a friendly ghost, but not really human. He's fully human. How do you know that? Because he eats and drinks. Ghosts don't eat and drink, right? He's incarnated in the flesh, and John's really clear about that. The word took on flesh. The Greek term is sarx, and it really is flesh with hair follicles and pimples and sweat glands. I mean, it's flesh. And when he comes back, he doesn't come back as this kind of non-corporeal spirit. He has breakfast with his disciples. He still eats. He's still in a fleshly body. It's resurrection of the flesh and not just immortality of the spirit. So from both a theological perspective and an ethical perspective, the Bible from Old Testament on into the New Testament tells us that bodies are really important and we're supposed to care for bodies. So even when Jesus sends out his disciples on their mission, he says, take care of these people, exorcise demons, give healing. That's what the church is supposed to do. Now, Jesus doesn't tell us how to pay for it. So, here we have to come in and figure out how this is going to work. Jesus heals by miracle, which at least here in the United States tells us that free healthcare is a miracle because we're not going to get it. But it may be something where people who say that they are followers of Jesus would be more concerned about healthcare and perhaps spending some of their resources in terms of providing healthcare for people if they need it. Vaccines, in under certain circumstances where they are needed, making sure that people are appropriately fed because food insecurity can create problems in the body. We starve, making sure that there's clean water because if we drink not clean water, we're going to get sick. And I think these healing narratives, which are so frequent, are saying if you want to be a follower of Jesus and you want to act the way Jesus does, then try to help people to see. Provide glasses, provide eye examinations. It's simple as that. And figure out where you're going to expend your particular talents in terms of that healthcare model.
Uh-huh. And AJ, Jesus' teachings have always been, often interpreted from a political lens. In many cases, in your book, how do you see this play out? The implication of his message, how people interpret it, with regards to the interaction with the Roman authorities and the stances on issues of paying taxes and stuff in the Roman world. How do you see that play out politically?
Well, so we can start with paying taxes, which is a fraught question. Everybody pays taxes. That's what they did back then. And Jesus, when he's asked, is it legal to pay the census tax? And Mark is very clear. It's a census tax, kensis in Greek. That's an iffy question. Because in Jewish culture, you're not supposed to take a census. When King David took a census, a plague broke out. Why? So we don't know exactly from the Bible why this is a problem, why counting people is a problem. But the rabbis tell us that Abraham was told your children will be as numerous as the stars in the heaven and the sands of the sea. And therefore, you can't count people. Even to this day, if you come into a synagogue, they're not going to count you, but they may give you, for example, a little token that you would use before you would say the blessing before and after the Torah. So you're number one or you're number two, and then you give the money back. There's a wonderful story from Josephus about you can't count the people coming into Jerusalem for pilgrimage, but what you can do is you can count the number of sheep livers based on the sacrifice and figure that one sheep equals 10 people, and then you can figure out how many people are there. This is what one of Herod Agrippa did, which I think is kind of funny. So the question is, should you pay the census tax? And this is debated in the first century. Should you do it? Shouldn't you do it? David does it in the Deuteronomic history. And when the chronicler retells the story, it's Satan who put David up to it. So, and if we get the sense that you don't count people. So what does Jesus say? First thing he says is, show me a coin, which tells me that he's not carrying any money, right? Again, what the services that he is providing, he's providing for free. And when he sends his disciples out, he says, don't take a purse, don't take any money. Matthew says, don't take gold and silver, which presumes they've got it to take. Be dependent upon other people. You provide health care and you provide spiritual resources, and they're going to provide you food and lodging. So show me a coin. Whose picture is on it? Caesar. And we know what those coins look like. And that's the divine Caesar, which is already a religious thing, right? Do you want to use coinage that markets polytheism if you happen to be a monotheist? Whose picture is on it? Caesar's. Okay, Jesus concludes, well, then give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and give to God what belongs to God, which means he doesn't answer the question. If he had simply said, yeah, sure, pay your taxes, the people who think that Rome is there illegitimately, because Judea, the story is set in Jerusalem in the temple, who think that the Romans are there illegitimately and people should have political autonomy, are going to say, well, the hell with you, because clearly you're not on my political spectrum. And the Romans, if Jesus says, don't pay your taxes, they're going to arrest him in chapter 12 rather than in chapter 15 of the Gospel of Mark. Right? So it's a question that says, think about it yourself. What actually belongs to God? The Psalms, the earth is the Lord's and all that's in it. Or do you pay your taxes because that's part of the human realm? Or do you not pay your taxes? And Jesus says, I'm not going to get embroiled in this particular political question because that's not my question. For Jesus, when he teaches his followers to pray, your kingdom come, and this is part of the Our Father prayer in both Matthew and Luke, your kingdom come means the kingdom that we've got is not the kingdom that we want. And that may cause us, I think, to sit back and say, well, what kind of kingdom is it that we want? And we don't do that. We just want God to come in and fix the whole thing. But I think Jesus makes us stop and think, well, what kind of kingdom do we want? In the Gospel of Matthew, and only in Matthew, he says, very odd scene where people come up to Jesus followers, to Peter, and say, "Does your teacher pay the temple tax?" Which is not the same thing as the tax at Rome. And the temple tax is a half shekel, and it had been a half shekel for 400 years, so like no one counting for inflation. But it basically says this is what you do if you want to identify as part of the Jewish community. You pay the temple tax. After 70, when Rome destroyed the temple, the tax becomes the fiscus judaicus, which in English would be the Jew tax, that the Roman government imposed upon Jews in order to pay for a pagan temple. Said this was a form of humiliation for them after losing the war. And Jesus says, the kings of the earth, they rule it over us, but you're sons, you're sons of God. You're free. But you know what? So as not to give offense, go pay the tax anyway. You don't have to, but you might want to do it for the sake of community values, for the sake of community solidarity. And I think that's also helpful. Do you need to give to this particular charity, even though the charity is not part of your system? And you might say, well, maybe I will, because I care about these people, for example. Just a very easy modern example. I'm in churches a lot. I mean, I'm probably in churches more than most Christians are. And when the collection plate gets passed, I will usually put something in there. I don't have to do that, right? It's not my church. It's not my collection. But I do it as a form of solidarity for the people who are around me, and also so not to give offense, because people are going to look at you, well, I shouldn't put any money on the plate. How do you show that type of solidarity? Just on a very simple level.
That sounds good. That sounds good. But now, AJ, given the polarized nature of modern politics, how can Christians discern the political, dimension of Jesus' teaching without reducing his message to a partisan ideologies of some sort?
What a great question. In other words, how do we take it out of the soundbite model? Like Jesus says, give me 5 words and that's going to take care of the whole political system. And it's not. So go back to what we were just talking about. If we say your kingdom come, what kind of kingdom is it that we want? What do we want from our government? And how will we contribute so that we can be part of that system? Where do we want to see our tax dollars going? How do we want our schools to function in a public school system? How do we want our hospitals to function so that everybody can have access to healthcare? And Jesus is saying, you think about that. And instead of thinking about the nitty gritty, I think what he's trying to help us do is engage in what we might call strategic planning. If the world is going to end on Tuesday, how would you fix this today? And instead of saying, oh, I'll let the leaders fix it. Well, if we're all mothers and brothers and sisters, and we're all children of God, and we're all part of this human endeavor created in the image and likeness of God, and therefore should be compassionate and generous as God is compassionate. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, God causes the sun to shine on the righteous and unrighteous alike. Like everybody's in it. What do we want? And Jesus encourages us through his parables about economics, which don't have good answers, but really raise good questions. Through his own activities, through his statement on taxes. So you sit down and you figure out what you want, and then you figure out how you're going to pay for it. And he's clear about that too. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, if you're about to build a house, you do a cost-benefit analysis before you build it. Or if you're about to go to war, you do a cost-benefit analysis to see if you've got some sort of victory. You sit down and you think about it, and you have a conversation rather than just come up with a slogan and march into politics. Think about stuff. Think about class and race and economics and healthcare and family values. Don't submit to lowest common denominator. Be strategic, as he puts it. Be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. You got to be both. Plan things, and as you plan things, you begin with the presupposition that you're a broader part of a family. It's where 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, not just the individual. You're part of a community. You're part of a neighborhood or a city or a country or a world. How do you use the Gospels, stories told by Jesus and stories told about him, to negotiate some of those differences? He's not going to give us all the answers. He's not like answer guy, but he's going to help us raise the right questions. And that is a gift. Our job then is to try to answer those questions first for ourselves, and then in community, So, what do you think about something? What does the person who's sitting in the next pew think about it? What does the person who's my friend on the internet in some other country think about it? And you start having those conversations so you're better prepared when you have to provide an answer. You've actually had something that's considered, that's discussed in community. And that's what Jesus is encouraging.
Uh-huh. AJ, you mentioned a lot of good things here, particularly in your book. We're running out of time, but before I let you go, I have two-part question that I want to ask you. Considering that we have this rapid changing cultural and religious landscape, and how do you envision the future landscape of Jesus' teaching as presented in your book? And the second part to that question would be, what role do you see, for interfaith dialogue in preserving and promoting the teachings of Jesus in the pluralistic world that we live in?
Yeah. The second question is easier. Um, the reason the book is the Bible for everybody, Jesus for everybody, not just Christians, is because I want other people who are not Christians to pay attention to what the Bible says and to pay attention particularly to what the Gospels say about Jesus and how the Gospels are quoting Jesus. I think beginning in terms of Jewish-Christian dialogue, this is really helpful because I bracketed questions of theology where there's going to be necessarily disagreement. But if we're talking about what Jesus said and did, bracketing the Christmas story, bracketing the story of the resurrection, then we've got a story about a Jew interacting in a first century Jewish environment. That's part of Jewish history. But we can broaden that out just beyond Jews and Christians who have particular reasons to be interested in this, whether theology or because it's Jewish history, to say, if we have a sense of global literature, so we can look at the works of Homer or the Bhagavad Gita, or the sayings of Confucius or Shakespeare or whoever, right? The Tale of Genji, in terms of global great literature. I think the Gospels are part of global great literature. And because I bracketed theological questions, atheists or Buddhists or Muslims, for whom Jesus has a role also, can be able to engage in this material. You can do ethics without having to do theology. And I'm interested in the ethics. In terms of how this is going to play out, I'm not a prophet. I'm an historian. I tend to look backwards rather than forwards. Prophecy is a spiritual gift. I'm not one of them. I'm just a mom and an academic. But what I would like to see is more attention to what the texts actually say in context, rather than people ripping out, this verse and saying, this is all I need. And even for well-intended Christians who say, Jesus says, all you need is love of God and love of neighbor. No, that's the greatest commandment. But there are all those other commandments that you're also supposed to follow, like love your father and mother and don't steal and don't kill, don't murder. So how do we look at the text as a greater whole? How do we understand Jesus' parables in light of the Sermon on the Mount? Or how do we understand the controversy stories in light of the crucifixion narrative? How do we try to hear what Jesus might have sounded like to the people who first heard him, like a bunch of first century Jews, or in the case of Pontius Pilate, a Roman governor? What happens when his stories get put into a gospel? Because the gospel writers are our first line of interpretation, because they're figuring out how to set the narrative. They're basically setting the storyline into which they're dropping in traditional material. How do we understand how these texts have been read over the centuries, including here, very anti-Jewishly, because the texts have been read to either inculcate or reinforce anti-Semitism. And I think that's bad news, and I don't think it's helpful to the text. So how do we do away with some of the anti-Semitism that's there? And then how do we read with respect on both sides so that non-Christians can have respect for Jesus, this first century teacher of ethics? That's great. And then have greater respect for Christians. And Christians can have respect and engage in dialogue with people who might not share their same theological views, but have the same concern for questions of politics and family values and ethics and healthcare. And I'm hoping that this book can do that by raising the right questions, or by raising questions that people haven't thought about, but questions that the Gospels encourage us, or at least they encourage me, to ask. And then we begin to have that conversation. I think that's super important.
I think that's super important when you mention there, AJ, because a lot of what we have today is a lot of anti-Semitism, as you point out, and many of them have come down throughout the ages. Perfect example would be a lot of people would view, the Pharisees in the Bible as hypocrites, and and Christ killers will be
Mhm.
Jews, in your next door neighbor Jew. They would say, you're a Christ killer. And all those things are things that we need to run away from, because they're not helpful in terms of this interreligious dialogue that we try to manifest. And your book is very helpful when it comes to that. I certainly recommend it.
Good. Well,
And
thank you for that.
yeah,
And,
thank you.
I think Jesus is really cool. I just wish people would pay closer attention to him.
Yeah, I think he's a cool guy.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks, AJ. And to our viewers at home, I certainly hope you've enjoyed this episode. And if you like the content, subscribe to us so that you can get feeds and the algorithms on YouTube, so they can know that you like our content, and you can get feeds as we publish the information. AJ, and to everybody at home, thank you for being on our show.
Always a pleasure.
Puluso Ministries is a non-profit educational enterprise founded in 2019. The ministry is informed by academic scholarship. At Puluso, we embrace multiple perspectives in our engagement with Scripture. We seek to provide non-Christians and Christians from all backgrounds and denominations with resources that provide an honest intellectual engagement with the Bible. We embrace multiple perspectives in fostering a more open, moderate society into the 21st century and beyond.